Hey there, emerging expat. You're tuned in to Let's Move to Portugal. I'm Victoria from Expats Everywhere's podcast, and I have the distinct honor of bringing you, YouTube travelers, and our resident of Portugal experts, Expats Everywhere's Josh and Kalie. Each week they'll inspire, they'll educate, and they'll accompany you on your journey to Portuguese residency. This week on Let's Move to Portugal, I shared my expat life in Portugal with Josh. The highs, the lows, comparing different cultures, and why I think Portugal has become a more dangerous place to live in. Stay tuned to find out.
Hey expats and travelers, welcome back to the Let's Move to Portugal podcast. This is season 4 that we're kicking off, episode 1. Super excited to be here. Kalie, how you doing?
I'm doing well. The typical question, if you're new to the podcast, Josh always asks me. Sometimes I try to get in there first and ask you, but generally I'm not fast enough.
No, because you don't want to cut me off like I just cut you off.
Yeah, but I think that sometimes also I give a long-winded answer, and then you just go, and then I have to, of course, ask you back. So I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good.
And then it's always short.
Yeah, because I want to tell you that if you're new here, the format of this podcast is typically where we start out with an introduction from Victoria. Then we get into a weekly welcome where we talk about, we welcome you to the podcast, but we talk about what's been happening in our world to catch you up to speed on what's going on in kind of the Portugal living abroad, moving abroad, visa space, all of that immigration stuff.
Fun stuff.
And then we transition into whatever the main events of the evening, morning, night is, which is typically an interview. Sometimes we interview people. Well, actually, we always interview people.
Yeah,
sometimes we interview people living here in Portugal, and other times we interview like businesses or services that can help you move here or settle in faster. So that's really what it's all about.
It's a good mix, I think.
That's what it's all about. Yeah. We get a kid. Okay, so we took a break and we've transitioned between season 3 and season 4. And in that meantime, we bought some stuff. So
Josh was so excited. Yeah. Hopefully we sound better. That's the goal.
Yeah. Sound and look better. Like, so we're not like hunched over a microphone. We still have that beautiful mic sitting here, but we've got, now our two better mics.
We have our own.
Yeah. Kalie's not good at sharing.
That's not true.
That's not true. I'm kidding. But no, we had an awesome time traveling and taking a break, but I'm really excited to be back. I'm especially excited to be back doing this podcast, getting back on it on a weekly basis. It's fun because it's a way that we get to kind of reflect on what's happened over the week and then also let you in on what's going on in our lives, because we don't always get to do that on the YouTube videos. The YouTube channel has changed.
Yeah, they're much. I mean, obviously videos have to be a little more like concise and to the point, to the topic. This is a little more like a longer format. We can chat. I mean, we can just say whatever we want.
We can. And I mean, we're already like several minutes into this and we haven't done anything. If you're new here, you don't even know who we are. So I'm Josh. This is Kalie. We've been living abroad since 2009. And doing this whole living abroad thing. We've been in Portugal since 2020. We're working on our completing our 5th year of residency here in Portugal, which will then make us eligible or allow us to be eligible for the citizenship here in Portugal.
We can actually technically apply later this year. Now that we're in 2025, Correct. We can apply later this year, which is
Correct.
Crazy to think that it's already been almost 5 years. I mean, not exactly, but almost.
Yeah, it's wild because 4 years passed in Singapore and it felt like a bat of an eye, but that was the longest place we'd ever lived.
Yep.
So, reflecting on that, it's strange. We have now surpassed Singapore, which I didn't actually think was going to happen for a while. I don't know about you.
I guess I hadn't really thought about it. I kind of go in with no expectations because you never really know. Yeah, it makes it a lot easier. And I think you adapt better without thinking, am I staying? Am I going? How long is that happening? But, Portugal's also been very different for us in the sense that we used to be teachers.
Yeah.
So we had different jobs. And obviously now we're all remote work. And we also have a child now, which is different. So I think that just has us doing different things, having a different lifestyle. And so I guess it's different, right?
Yeah, I definitely think it's different in that way. I mean, I think when you look at how Portugal's different compared to the other countries we hadn't spent a significant amount of time in. In fact, the first 3 countries we moved to, which were Spain, South Korea, and Saudi Arabia, we had not even visited the country before moving there.
Right.
And then in Singapore, we had at least visited while living in Saudi Arabia. We took a trip to Southeast Asia, hitting up Indonesia, then Singapore, then Malaysia. And we had an idea like, oh, okay, Southeast Asia is pretty awesome. Let's see what it would be like to live there.
Mm-hmm.
And we had visited Singapore. So that was the first time that had happened. But when we lived in Spain, we had been to Portugal so much, it felt very familiar. And we knew that we preferred it over Spain. So it was almost like, well, let's just go there now that they've got that visa that we can apply for and get.
Yeah, it was kind of an easier move in that sense. We knew what we were getting into, I guess.
Yeah.
But also too, when we moved, we hadn't even thought about the citizenship thing. It was after we moved that people started asking us, and we thought, oh, it obviously makes sense. Like 5 years is easy. It's, it's nothing. So it'll open up so many more opportunities for us to move somewhere else in the EU, and then for our daughter for university, for jobs. So you can hold both passports. So you can be a U.S. citizen and have a Portuguese passport as well. So it makes sense. And it's already here. Almost. I mean, I say that, but I mean, we are in 2025 now. So I feel like it's here.
Yeah. I would say what will likely happen is by the time, like, as this season here, season 4 progresses, towards the end of it, we'll probably start laying the foundation for putting in our application.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to think when dates hit, but I'm pretty sure like at the end of season 4, maybe in just at the beginning of season 5, we'll start that process.
Yeah.
So you're kind of along here, listener, you're along for the ride if you want to be.
And I think what we should do is we should get a lawyer on the podcast to explain what the process is like as we're going through it as well. I think that would be helpful.
For sure.
So that you, listener, if you're, a little bit behind us, you'll know what to expect and what to do.
Yeah. That's also the thing is like, yes, this is the Let's Move to Portugal podcast, but some people have already arrived here.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, for them, it's like the Let's Live in Portugal podcast, which it
kind
of is like that. Call it what you want. That is actually a podcast name.
Call it what you want.
I think call it what you want.
That's funny.
Yeah. But I digress.
Yeah.
So
as usual.
Yeah. So coming back to what we're talking about, this podcast is really for a wide range of people. Maybe not every episode tickles your fancy, but I hope it does. Right?
Yeah. I mean, we try to cover a lot of topics that will be beneficial to everyone, no matter what stage you're in.
Yeah.
Some will be more than others, of course, though. That's normal.
Yeah. Those that
More
are
beneficial
thirsty for Portugal stuff, you're here. You're in the right spot.
Yeah. Because
Right.
we also do stuff. I mean, obviously, once you live in Portugal, you're in Europe and it's very easy to travel. So we do feature, like, when we travel,
Yeah.
like in one season, we compared some Spanish cities we were in to different Portuguese cities. So you can get an idea for that. We did it for Italy as well. So we like to do that too, because you travel. You get to travel a bit more around Europe, and then we want to give like a comparison as to some of these cities and these locations to some of the Portuguese cities as well.
Exactly. And would you like us to do that for Belgium? Because we just recently got back from a trip to Belgium where we experienced 3 different cities. 2 were good, 1 not so good. Not so good.
It wasn't that bad.
No, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't good either.
Okay.
So like I wouldn't recommend living in that
Okay.
place.
Ooh.
1, I just learned how to
Cliffhanger.
pronounce it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's that.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
could do that. I mean, one thing was cold. It was cold there.
It was
Happy
cool.
to get back to Porto. But okay, so let's move on and feature like what this kickoff season 4, episode 1 is about. Josh, you want to explain?
Yeah, sure. So we haven't actually formally introduced the audience to Victoria, that lovely voice that you hear at the beginning of our episodes. So if you're used to what we do here on this podcast, you've probably gotten used to hearing her as opposed to our former podcast producer, Dan. And Dan was the one, shout out to him, that really pushed us to create content in this format. Whereas he's a producer back in the US that was doing other shows, and he was interested himself in moving to Portugal. So he reached out and wanted to push us to basically make a podcast. And he made an awesome podcast. We were just kind of voices.
Yeah. What do we do,
but
Dan?
he was the producer behind the scenes.
Yeah, it was great.
And then,
we have a great relationship with him, so he just had to
Amazing.
step away.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
happens.
Life changed for him, and his situation changed. And he asked if we could find somebody to
Fill in.
replace,
Yeah.
fill in, step in for him.
Mhm.
And that's when we had Victoria in mind as the perfect replacement because she's a creative person, young, hungry, knows American culture and Portuguese culture. So that little nuance could be really valuable. Whereas Dan was the one that was like from the outside looking in, wanting to move to Portugal. So he's very much like plenty of our audience members. There's also this gem in who Victoria is, where she's been on the side of the US and then also has lived most of her life, now half of her life, in Portugal. So it's just fascinating that she's got that.
And you two talk about that, right?
We do. Yeah. I mean, Victoria shares her journey of moving to Portugal at a young age, and, what cultural differences that she's observed and the challenges, especially as integrating as a foreigner, as a foreign kid. And really, if she's been able to make that transition from just being the foreigner, we've heard that that's been challenging for people, for different parents of kids. So, if you're not moving with kids, or if you're not a parent,
it doesn't matter on this one.
It doesn't matter on this one. You can, I know that there are things that you're going to be able to pick up from what she says, so that you can have the right expectations for your move, your relocation, your immigration, whatever you want to call it. Whether you consider yourself an expat or an immigrant, whether you're considering moving to Portugal for a few years or for the rest of your life, I think it's really valuable what she says and how she can help reframe your expectations.
Ooh, goody.
In saying all that, again, this is one person's perspective, and what we will try to do, what our goal in this podcast is to bring a variety of perspectives so that you can kind of round out what your experience might be like.
Yeah.
But everyone no two experiences are the same.
No, and everyone has different opinions on things, different ways that certain things happen and it makes you feel, or how you want to do stuff, how it makes you think. So that's why we want to have variety. Yeah. So this is interesting.
This is season 4, episode 1. And typically we do not like to go over 10 minutes for the weekly welcome.
So Josh says, but this will try to be better this season.
This is a special one. I can't wait for you to meet Victoria properly. This is Victoria. Let's meet her. All right. But before we do that, let's talk about this week's sponsor, Green Ocean Global Advisors.
Yes, we always recommend, no matter where you are in the moving process, to get your finances in order. So that's in your home country and then the country that you're moving to.
And speaking about homes, what if you sell your house before leaving or do it after? What are the capital gains implications like? Well, a financial advisor will be able to walk you through this type of thing.
And what about distributions? Maybe you have a 401k or a pension and you need to figure out how much you should be drawing from for the lifestyle that you're going to have.
Now, you can use this link in the description section below to talk to John from Green Ocean Global Advisors to see if he's a fit for you. You'll have a free 15-minute consultation just for being an Expats Everywhere listener. So you can use that to get your free 15 minutes. Click the link in the description section below. Now, on to the show. What is up, Victoria? It has been a couple months in the making that we were going to make this piece to introduce you to our audience. You've been talking to the audience at the beginning of every episode for a good dozen episodes now. Now they get to put a face to the voice. Victoria, how you doing?
I'm doing well, Josh. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here.
I mean, it's practically like you're having yourself on, let's be honest. But we really appreciate the fact that you have taken over the production of this podcast. And we want to let the listener get to know you a bit more because you have more experience living in Portugal than me and Kalie do. So we want to let you kind of talk us through what your experience has been like, share the things that you've learned about Portuguese culture. And then also it's really cool because you're part of the younger generation of Portuguese, if you will. So you can tap into that. You have a good balance because you are an American national, but you've grown up here. Your formative years were here in Portugal. So let's go back to the States. How old were you when you moved, and why did your family decide to move?
Yeah, so I had just turned 8 when we moved to Portugal. We moved as missionaries to come to Portugal and start churches. And before that, we had previously been living in Ukraine for a couple years. So the first 2 years of my life were in Ukraine. And then we lived in the States for 6 years, in California specifically. And then we decided to move to Portugal. And we've been here for 13 years.
Yeah, definitely more than 8. Okay, so So 2 years in Ukraine, do you remember anything from that experience? No. Okay.
No.
Do you remember some things from your time in the States? I mean, obviously, I know that you all have been back visiting the States, but what can you tell us?
Yeah, so I definitely do have some memories from when I lived there. More so memories from when we visited, and there definitely is a big difference in the culture and just even the people. And whenever we go to visit, I feel like a foreigner. It's like a culture shock going back there.
I understand.
Yeah, so just very, very different cultures. Both have their own pros and cons, but yeah, very different.
Yeah, the reason why I say I understand is because Kalie and I have been living abroad for 15 years, and despite not that much changing in 15 years, there's enough things that have changed, certainly pop culture wise, with different generations, making their way as they get older, like making their way up to influencing different parts of society in the US. Kalie and I, sometimes when we go back, we feel like the foreigners. And it's even harder, actually, because it's like, I know I am these people. I know I am American, but I have a hard time maybe making connections or knowing what the heck someone's talking about because they're using different words that I hear on a regular basis. So what are some of those things that you've experienced like that?
Okay, I think one was last time we visited, we were at my aunt's house and they wanted to make something called a Frito salad, I think.
Okay.
And I was like, I don't know what that is. I think it's like a specific type of chip, like
Yes.
salad.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know what that is. And my dad's like, oh, it's because we've been in Portugal for so long and it's just a type of chip.
Yeah, exactly. Are there any
Yeah.
dishes like that in Portugal where they use a specific brand? Like a Frito's a
Ooh,
brand, right? And a chip,
yeah.
I guess, but yeah.
Not that I know of. We definitely use some words, I think, like the brand name instead of the actual name for the item.
Okay.
But I don't know about for food specifically. That's an interesting question, though.
Well, I'm curious then, what are some things in Portugal that use the brand name? Because I feel like in the States, we're much more like brand conscientious, and like we use those brand names to mean the item itself. But here I don't find that. But enlighten me.
Yeah. The only one I know of is like the Gillette like razor.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, so a few years ago, some colleagues of mine were referring to that word, and I didn't know what it was until I went to the store. I was like, "Oh, it's the brand name. They're not actually calling it by like a razor."
Yeah.
So
Interesting.
yeah.
Okay. So it's funny even how you pronounce it, because you're saying Gillette, which is the way to pronounce it in, I guess it's French, right? Is where it comes from. Definitely European.
Yeah.
But I think most Americans would say Gillette.
Gillette. Yeah, I guess I've
Gillette.
never heard that use it in a English way, English language.
Yeah, no, totally.
So
Well, something funny that happened with me and Kalie is when we were living in Spain, we first heard of the hotel chain Ibis. I mean, in English it would be Ibis, but we had literally never heard of it referred to as Ibis until we were talking to some British friends of ours, and we kept saying Ibis, and they were like, "What are you talking about?" And we're like, the hotel. And then finally they put two and two together that we were talking about Ibis. And then we put two and two together that like that's an animal,
Oh, really?
But yeah, but I guess that's the reason they chose that name for the hotel brand. I don't know. You have to fact check me on that. But even here in Portugal, it's pronounced a little differently because the S at the end of a word.
Ibish, probably.
Ibis. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
so we oftentimes still say Ibis because that's how we learned it. So that's the cool thing about, living abroad, spending long periods abroad. You start to adapt your vocabulary, right?
Yeah. Like there's still some words that because I've used them mainly in Portuguese, even in an English conversation, I'll say the Portuguese word, especially like in sports because I played sports for 3 years. So some of those words I still say in Portuguese.
Okay. So proper bilingual. Yeah, you would say you're proper bilingual.
Yes.
Do your Portuguese friends look at you as like the foreigner, or no?
Probably.
Okay.
Probably. Yeah.
You haven't had those conversations with them?
I mean, I think not really, actually. They don't. Maybe years ago, some of my teammates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they would ask me like about living in America and, stuff like that. But really, they haven't asked me much about, being an American or anything like that. So maybe in the back of their minds, they'll always see me as a foreigner, but they don't really like treat me like one.
Why do you think that is?
Ooh, I don't know. Maybe because, I mean, I knew them. I've known them since I was like young, 12, 13.
Mm-hmm.
And so maybe they just got used to the idea that I'm a foreigner. But here's the thing with Portuguese. They're very curious, but they're also very reserved. So they won't ask you questions, even though they want to. They'll just kind of keep it to themselves. Because they're more reserved, and so maybe they had a lot of questions about being an American, like why am I here in Portugal? Like when we moved to Portugal, it was like almost unheard of, because at the time a lot of Americans didn't know where Portugal was.
Yeah.
And here in Portugal, at the time they didn't have a lot of foreigners, and so I guess I don't know. I'm not sure why they ever asked, or they never asked. But yeah.
Yeah. So if I'm doing the math right, and we've never talked about this, you moved in like 2002, 2003?
2011.
Oh, 13 years. I was thinking 23 years, but that's your age. That's your age. Yes. 2011. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. So obviously it doesn't make sense for us to talk to the 8-year-old you about visas and stuff like that. That's not really important, or why we want to have this conversation with you. We want to really get to know and learn just more about Portuguese culture, society from someone who's been in it, but is American. So what are some things that parents should know about raising a kid, a foreigner, here in Portugal?
Well, I would say that if you decide to put them in an international school or decide to do online schooling, and they're not getting that connection to the Portuguese kids through the public school, then they should be involved in the community through like sports, gymnastics, dance, anything like that.
Great advice.
Yeah, it's important to get your kids involved in the Portuguese community in one way or another. So because I was homeschooled, I did sports, and that's how not only me, but my sister and my parents, we all got involved into the community that way. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend to parents.
How many hours a week were you in contact with Portuguese, like during these really formative years? Because like Kalie and I find that we're oftentimes, at least she and I are oftentimes isolated within our work, which is online in English. And unless we leave our apartment, we don't really have many interactions in Portuguese. Our daughter, on the other hand, is in a Portuguese school. So it's like she's getting it every day. And then only when she re-enters the house does she get English.
Yeah, so I was probably getting about, trying to do the math in my head, maybe at least 6 or 7 hours of Portuguese. No, probably less than that. Maybe about 5 or 6 hours a week.
A day? Oh, a
week. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So did you find it quite slow then to learn Portuguese, or?
No, actually, because for my homework for school, for my homework was to watch cartoons in Portuguese.
Oh, okay. What were some of your favorite cartoons?
Ooh, there was a lot of cartoons. I like Disney Channel shows, but we'd watch them dubbed, and which was, I mean, it was what we became used to, but It was weird because the voices wouldn't match the mouths.
Right.
Let me think, like Noddy. Maybe like Panda when we were much younger.
Okay.
And then as we got older, we watched the Disney Channel shows.
Okay. Well, it's going to be your responsibility to edit this and put the different links in the show notes below. So that's on you.
Sure.
That's on you. You'll be able to remember it then when you do that.
Okay.
Did you and your sister, because you have an older sister, did you take the same approach? She's a couple years older than you, so it's not like there's a huge age gap. But did you take the same approach to learning Portuguese?
Yeah. We would watch the cartoons together, and in that sense, we would take the same approach.
Did you have the same friends, or your personalities are a bit different? So did you gravitate towards different people?
We definitely, I would say, because we weren't always on the same team, but there was a couple girls on our team that spoke English, so we gravitated towards them. But really, we always kind of had difficulties making friends because, as I said before, like the Portuguese are very reserved. And even though they can be very warm and friendly, like on the outside, but it's hard for them to really accept you. So like for probably most of the time I was playing sports, I never really had any friends, just like acquaintances.
Can you explain that a bit more? Because I think there's a really important distinction to make between how friendly Portuguese people are in terms of like their warmth in one kind of aspect of like a social interaction, but then like actually getting into the friend circle and into someone's heart is different and more challenging. So can you kind of dig into that a little more for us?
Yeah. So in my experience, like I was always the outsider of my team. It also had a lot to do with my personality, more reserved. And it also didn't help that the Portuguese are also more reserved. So maybe they'd be like friendly and nice on the outside, but I would never in teams, they have their little cliques, the little groups. And I never was really part of it. Until maybe like 1 year, I finally had a little group of friends. But I think because Portuguese are so reserved, and then on top of being a foreigner, and these girls were so young, and so they had never really had experiences with foreigners before, I guess. So I was never really I never fit in. Yeah.
Okay. That seems incredibly challenging and possibly a concern for parents as they move their kids abroad. I mean, if we have any listeners that are considering moving, whether you're moving a primary school kid or a secondary school kid to Portugal, these are some of the things that might end up happening and might make ultimately like your long-term stay here challenging. Would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I think the younger your child is when you move them, the easier it will be. So I was 8, my sister was 9. So maybe we were still young, but maybe in terms of being like fitting in, old. Maybe a little too old. Yeah. And we weren't in school. So maybe that didn't help either, like public school.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for us, for me and Kalie, it's gonna be like a wait and see to see how our daughter Valencia does, because we moved here when she was 9 months old. We got her into school at 2 years old, and she's now midway through her 3rd year at the same school. So she's essentially been raised in Portuguese schools, but who knows how down the road she's going to be treated by native born Portuguese. I think she's going to sound quite Portuguese when she speaks Portuguese. I think the issue would be how she herself interacts with Portuguese, because we've already noticed in her class, because there are several foreigners, that she gravitates towards the other kids who speak English. And we're on her all the time. We're like, Valencia, at school, you have to speak Portuguese. Like, no English there. Like that, unless you're in English class in your school, like you have to speak Portuguese. And she gets that, but it's just natural for her because she can communicate better, more efficiently and effectively in English compared to Portuguese at the moment.
Yeah, so probably in a couple of years she'll get more comfortable just speaking just in Portuguese. But she'll probably have a lot easier time like fitting in with the other kids than I did, because she basically grew up in that culture since she was a little baby. So she'll have a lot easier time.
Okay, so speaking of culture, what are some of the cultural differences? What are some of the I don't know, the differences or strange things that you noticed in between American and Portuguese?
Oh man. Well, Portuguese are very family centric, and I think it depends on the American family, but I think in general Americans are maybe a little bit more individualistic. But you can correct me if I'm wrong, Josh.
I agree with you.
Okay, because like
I think if nothing else, like in the States, we would maybe be more nuclear family versus it seems like in Portugal the family net is wider.
Exactly. Yeah. It also depends on the family, because I have a few American friends who are more like with all the extended family, you know, for Thanksgiving and Christmas. It's more like Portuguese culture in that sense.
Okay.
Even though they're American. So I'd say that's definitely a big one. I think Americans in general are just super outgoing, and compared to Portuguese, in my experience, I feel like I don't have enough experience in the American culture, like properly, because I was so young, to really be able to compare.
But is that a shock whenever you go back to the States, like, and you have these people, whether young or old, like they're coming up and talking to you and interacting more and asking you questions and more curious, and you're like, back off, guys. Get me back to Portugal.
Yeah, it definitely is. It is a culture shock for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Has your sister complained about anything? Like, has she noticed any differences that she's talked to you about? Because I'm sure you all are close enough to be like, wasn't that weird when this happened?
Yeah. So I think because our personalities are different. When we left America, she had a little bit of a harder time than I did. And so she kind of misses our like life in America a bit more than I do. So maybe I don't think she would have had such an issue with the huge cultural differences. Like last time we visited, which was 3 years ago, I started getting homesick for Portugal, and I don't know if my sister ever got homesick. I think she felt more at home in America than I did, even though there's like a year and a half between us.
So interesting. We've had this conversation on a couple occasions offline, and I find that so wild. I mean, obviously there's a personality difference. To me, it wouldn't seem as if like that year and a half of development between 8 and 9.5 would be that big of a difference, but it's fascinating because you've said that you could see yourself here in Portugal, or at least in Europe, potentially for the rest of your life, where it seems like your sister's more looking at moving back to the US sooner rather than later. Is that right? Fair to say?
Yeah. So she's definitely more open to going back to America than I am. I could maybe see myself living there for like maybe no more than a year, a very short term if I needed to. But I've really, I guess, embraced Portugal as my home more so than my sister. But she's come along as well. But she still has that more of a desire to go back to America than I do.
So interesting. And what are you all doing right now for university?
Yeah, so we're actually both getting the same master's degree. It's master's in biblical studies with an emphasis on theology. So it's an online university, which makes it really easy for our type of life. We can just study from home, and it's very flexible with the hours and such.
What did you do for undergrad?
I got a bachelor's in biblical studies as well, but with an emphasis on counseling.
Was any of this required for you to like remain in Portugal? Like, how did that work? Because now that you're an adult, like I assume this is just an assumption I'm making. I assume that you have to, in some way, because you've not claimed citizenship here in Portugal, you have to in some way like keep your status here current. So explain that to us.
Yeah, so this actually happened very recently. My residency visa expired, and we were waiting for months and months to get an appointment, but because of all the CEF to IMA change, it got backlogged. And so we were worried that because I'm not studying here and because I am of legal age, so I'm not like a dependent, I think is what they call it in America. And so we were worried that might, make things more difficult to renew my visa.
Yeah.
And
it's we should make a distinction here. Instead of visa, it's a residency permit.
Residency permit.
Yeah, because the visa is the thing that you first get when you're moving, but then it's the permit. Yeah. Yes. So you have a temporary residency permit, and then you have I think it's a permanent or long term. I think it's called permanent residency. But that one's good, I believe, for 10-year intervals. Kalie's better at this than I am. But the other one is like 3 to 5 years for the temporary. But you're on which one?
Temporary.
Okay. So you have to renew it every
3 or
5 years?
Yeah.
3 or 5? Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's a good clarification because I was using the wrong word.
It's okay.
So yeah, and because like I'm working, but not for a Portuguese company, and I'm studying, but not at a Portuguese school. So we were worried that it might make things complicated. But when we went, I finally got my appointment to renew my residency. And my parents my mom was really worried about it. My dad wasn't worried so much because he said the most difficult part was getting the appointment. And then it was just, he was confident that it would be really smooth process, and he was right. Yeah. Maybe just the person that was, doing our appointment was just very easy and helpful. Or maybe it was just that our situation wasn't as complicated as they thought it was, but it was overall just a really easy process, super straightforward. We explained to him that I am studying and I'm working, but it's not for anything here in Portugal. And yeah, it was super smooth.
He was just like, okay.
Yeah, okay.
Approved.
Yeah, pretty much.
Did your sister have to do the same thing at the same time, or did you have different appointment dates?
So my dad, my mom, and my sister's permits all got renewed automatically, except for mine.
Oh, that's so fun. It was the
strangest thing. Yeah, it was the strangest thing. And we didn't know why, because I've been here for 13 years, and so you think it would just renew automatically. But we had to go to Braga and renew it there. Yeah.
Do you have any desire? I'm going to ask the question that I think our audience is thinking right now. You've been here 13 years. It's way past 5 years. You have any desire to become citizen?
Yes. Yeah, I do. I think it took this almost messy situation with my residency permit getting renewed to kind of push us in that direction. Because I think we've always wanted to get citizenship, but it's just, there's so many other things in our life going on right now that so it just kind of got put on the back burner. But I think now we're really gonna take more steps to get citizenship. I think I could pass the language test by now. I hope so.
Come on now. Have you tested actually to see where you're at?
So years ago, when I think my dad, he was taking Portuguese lessons, and he had like a test, and I for some reason, my mom and my sister and we all went and took the test as well. And it was like a written test. It wasn't an oral test, and I was only like 13 at the time. And I don't think I did very well because, okay, one of the cons of learning Portuguese through cartoons is that you don't learn the proper grammar, like written grammar.
Sure.
I just know, like, okay, I know what sounds correct in my head, but I don't know the grammar rules. And so sometimes when people ask me, like, oh, what's the rule for this? I just think in my head what sounds correct, just because of what I've heard from other people. And so I think that affected how I did in this written test.
Okay.
And I was just very nervous to be taking a test at all.
Sure.
And so I don't know how well I did. I remember getting a few things wrong, but recently I haven't ever taken any tests.
Well, let me ask you in a different way then. Like what can and can't you do when it comes to operating in Portuguese, both when it comes to listening and speaking?
Ooh. Well,
like what topics can you talk about? How deep can you go?
That's a good question. So I definitely have a lot of limits, as I'm realizing more and more. There are just some things that I can't like properly discuss. Like in our ladies Portuguese Bible study, there were some things like more technical topics that I'm really interested in. And I would have a lot to say about them in English, but in Portuguese, I wasn't able to explain myself, and that caused a little bit of confusion.
Okay.
But the ladies are very gracious, and they understood that it's my second language.
But you also do translation work from English to Portuguese.
Yes. Yeah.
So go ahead. I mean, like, do you get caught up sometimes with that as well? Because I actually find your Portuguese, when I hear it, really clear, but maybe you're using the simplified words. I don't know. So it's easier for me to understand.
Yeah, I think for translating, it's more simple vernacular, just because of whatever this Bible study is on, the teaching is on. But in our Braga church, we have two other pastors there, and they print out their teachings, so I just have to read off of it, which makes my life very easy. But they use more technical, advanced words I wouldn't even use in English. So that makes it a little bit more tricky in one sense. It's easier because I can read off of it, but also a little difficult because they're words I'm not familiar with. So, but when I'm like translating for my dad, he doesn't have his script. I have to like actually translate it myself. But he uses easier words. So they both have their pros and cons.
All right, fair enough. Okay, let's kind of jump back to a little more about Portuguese society, some things that we should be aware of. What is it like being a young woman in terms of safety being in Portugal? You live on the Gaia side of Greater Porto, and you have come over to the Porto side at night. What's the contrast there? How do you feel personally?
So Portugal is a very safe country. Because I've lived here for most of my life, I can't really compare it to other countries in terms of safety. But I would say in some ways, I feel like it is getting a little bit more dangerous. Just especially in Porto, just the different types of people that live there. Generally, it is very safe up until like even 10 o'clock, I would say. But as a young girl, if I'm by myself, I always try to be aware of my surroundings, because you never know what could happen. But I still feel safe because I'm in Portugal, but I still always have to be alert and aware, no matter where you are as a young girl. So I think it is getting a little bit more dangerous, maybe lately, but overall it's pretty safe.
You have any idea what's caused that?
Maybe just the types of people that are immigrating over here.
Okay.
I don't want to like generalize, but
I think it's fair to say that.
Okay.
That's fair to say that. I mean, we've had these conversations with our Portuguese friends as well, and there's a concern. So when Victoria is talking about the rise in the feeling of danger, it's because there are some people that are moving here that they don't share similar cultural values as Portugal, and that kind of creates tension. Whether it's real or perceived, it's still there. So certainly people who might feel more threatened in uncomfortable situations are going to feel it more. And I think, as being a young lady, yeah, I mean, I can understand why you would maybe feel it more for sure.
Yeah.
So what are some areas that you would recommend people avoid and at what times?
I mean, I guess it depends on where you are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to think. Because especially now as Portugal is becoming more and more popular, there's more and more tourists out and about, even now because it's around the Christmas time. But I would say, I think anything past 10 o'clock should try to be careful. But it also depends on how many people you're with. Maybe past 10 o'clock, try to, be more careful if you're in like the center of Porto, definitely. But generally, even the people that are like maybe like homeless or drunk, we don't have a lot of them, but they even kind of keep them themselves. They don't really like go out, bother people.
I've noticed that as well.
Yeah. So yeah.
Is this a conversation that your Portuguese friends have? Like, do the younger people talk about this as a concern, or like they're just kind of blind to it?
Well, I will say I'm saying this from a secondhand source. So
Okay.
my sister, she still plays sports, and she and her team recently went to Lisbon for a game, and they made a stop in a city called Amadora.
Mm-hmm.
And so apparently that city is very well known because it has a lot of crime there.
Mm-hmm.
And so but Isabella didn't really know that. Well, she didn't realize which city she was in at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But her teammates, who are Portuguese, they were saying that they were really worried about going into the gas station and even just going to the bathroom because they didn't want to get like robbed or assaulted because of the city that they were in. So to answer your question, they probably have these conversations. I guess specifically if it's a very dangerous city like Amadora.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure about just like Porto and Gaia specifically.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. I'm sure they do.
It's really interesting that you bring up Amadora because we were driving around with some Portuguese friends, and we were coming from Évora, passed up through Setúbal, and then drove through Amadora, right? Because Amadora is the one that's just before the bridge to get over to Lisbon, if I'm thinking about this correctly. And they actually talked about it as well. Like this has one of the biggest social housing projects. It's known to be one of the most dangerous, if not the most dangerous, statistically, cities in Portugal. So maybe even at this point, Amadora has a reputation among Portuguese. Would you say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the only reason I heard about that city and in that context of how it's dangerous is from a meme online.
Oh, really? What was the meme?
It was just kind of, what's the word? I forget the word. Making fun of like different cities, kind of like what
like stereotypes.
Stereotypes, yeah. That's the word.
Yeah.
Amadora was on there, and they talked about like the crime there, and I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know that.
What are some other? I mean, it's interesting that you bring up the word meme because I'm curious to know, like, what are some other among your generation, some of the other things that like Portuguese youngsters talk about? I say youngsters like I'm an old man, but you know what I mean? Like give us a clue of like what's happening for the people that are like 18 to 25. Like what's that vibe like? I know that you're not going to a local university or anything, but like how do people dress? How do they speak? What types of music do they listen to? That kind of thing.
Well, young Portuguese like to listen to Brazilian type of music called funk, Brazilian funk.
Okay.
And as well as maybe like not the typical Portuguese music, because the typical Portuguese music is more like fado. It's more
Pimba?
sad. I've never heard of Pimba.
Oh, okay.
Maybe I've heard it, but I just don't know the name.
Yeah. Okay.
But they like it, not so much English music, but a lot of Brazilian music they like listening to.
Okay.
And as far as for what they're dressing, my dad notices a bigger difference in what they dress than I do.
Okay.
Because I always just kind of assumed that because we have some stores here that are similar to stores in America. So I always just thought that Portuguese were being influenced by what people wear in America, because America has a huge cultural influence, like pop cultural influence on the rest of the world.
Certainly in Europe, but if not the whole world, that's it. Yeah, agreed.
But my dad noticed more a difference between dressing like as a European and versus American, which I guess I can notice that as well. Like when I'm out and about and there's a lot of tourists, and if I see a few tourists passing by, in my head I'm like, oh, those people are probably American, and they walk by and they're speaking English with an American accent. Like, yeah.
What are some of the tells, like either that you've noticed or your dad pointed out?
Tells, well, I guess they just dress in more, I think Americans dress with more colors than typical Europeans do.
Okay.
So maybe more like brighter blues, especially if they're like a tourist.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure we in Portugal, my generation, they don't really wear shorts so much, even in the summer. They wear like pants like all summer long. You could be like, I don't know this in Fahrenheit, but it could be like 30 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
And people will still be wearing like pants, versus in America, they wear more shorts and such. I'm not sure why.
Yeah.
But Portuguese, they just like wearing pants, and even people of other ages, when it's like hot, they can still wear a hoodie and a jacket, pants. So I'm not sure why.
Yeah. So 30 degrees Celsius is like the mid 80s in Fahrenheit. And for the north, for sure, like where we live, it's hot. Now,
yes.
for the south, for Algarve, and depending on the heat waves that might happen in Lisbon, it can get into the 90s. It can be like mid 30s, right? It can get that hot, and it's really hot. And yeah, you'll still see people in pants. It blows my mind. It's like you can go to a shop and there are shorts. Pick up a pair of shorts and be comfy, man. Like, what are we doing?
Yeah.
I had this conversation actually on just a few days ago with a friend of ours, Portuguese friend, and we were talking about this, like how you can always kind of tell a Portuguese person versus a British person with the winter weather. If the temperature here gets into like the upper 50s or lower 60s, you might still see a British person in shorts and a t-shirt as a tourist. And he said he had a funny experience when he took a trip to Cuba, and he was in Havana walking around with shorts and sandals. So he's on vacation, right? So that's his vacation suit, right? Shorts and sandals. And he's like, it was unseasonably cold for the Cubans. So Cubans had jackets and pants and stuff on, and they were dressing like it was cold. And he was telling me it was equivalent of like in the 70s Fahrenheit. So like 20s, I guess, in Celsius. I thought that was so funny though. It's like, oh, so you guys do wear shorts. It's just outside of Portugal.
Yeah. Yeah. I recently met a family. They're from the Caribbean, but they've been living in Canada for, I think, over 20 years.
Okay.
And so they came like over the weekend. It's been quite cold lately. But for them, they said it felt like summer.
Yeah. That's funny.
It was crazy.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it was hyperbole from them, but it has been a very easy winter so far, which has been phenomenal. Yeah. Okay. So you've started doing podcast production for us, and why did you decide to jump in and take the reins of the podcast?
Well, it just sounded really interesting to me, and I love because of my personality, I've always been interested in multiple different things, never like just one thing. And so I always kind of like the idea of working multiple smaller jobs. Mm-hmm. And so when you called me and you gave me this opportunity, I was really excited because I was like, oh, this is great, because, you know, I don't like just working in one area. I like to be able to do different little things.
Yep.
And so and it's tech related, which is my area, something I'm interested in. And it's a good way to give me different experiences and to learn different things and to help you guys out, of course.
Nice. No, we appreciate it. What do you hope to bring the podcast?
Like your podcast specifically, or in general?
Yeah. No, what do you hope to bring this podcast? Let's Move to Portugal podcast.
Honestly, just help to give it good quality and the editing and production side of it, so that, you know, it can help to reach more people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to be quite honest with you. One of the big reasons why we wanted to bring you in is because your ability to pronounce things correctly in Portuguese. So whenever those things pop up, or like a name needs to be said in the intro, if you're not a first-time listener, if this is like your second or more podcast episode that you're listening to, you should have definitely heard Victoria's voice at this point. But she's the one that's at the very beginning for the first 30 to 45 seconds, giving us the rundown of what's going to happen. And your pronunciation's on point. At least it is to my ear.
Thank you. Thank you.
Do you think that you would be available if people email you at podcast@expatseverywhere.com? You could answer questions that they have, or at least put their questions in a show for us to do maybe once a season.
Yeah, for sure.
Would you be open for that? Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Because, you know, you never know, like at the end of this episode, people might have more questions they have for you, being a 20-something living here in Portugal that understands both Portuguese and American culture. And they might have some questions for you that maybe we could do a Q&A all together, even bring you in on it to answer those things that Kalie and I just can't answer because we're old and we're not Portuguese.
Yeah, for sure. If anyone has any questions, I'd be down for that.
Okay, awesome. Victoria, first of all, thank you so much for joining this episode. But second, thanks so much for joining the podcast and the Expats Everywhere team and helping us produce this. And listener, thank you for listening in on this one. We've had fun with you. And if you have any questions for Victoria, please email podcast@expatseverywhere.com. You can throw them her way.
Thanks for having me.
Take care.